As described in the Jedi Path, the act of constructing a lightsaber forever marks Padawans as members of the Jedi Order. The construction of a lightsaber is more than an act of loyalty to the organization. It is an opportunity to make a saber of one's own. The Jedi strive for consistency in manner and dress, but they do not make rules for this most personal of weapons. Master Yoda goes on to provide the following commentary. Know themselves Padawans must, before a unique lightsaber they can build. Each lightsaber carried a set of the following components: the hand grip, the emitter matrix, the lens assembly, the power cell, and the focusing crystal. As customization was encouraged when Jedi built their lightsabers, the selection of materials at this stage was meant to be guided by the Force. For example, the Neti Jedi, Trasa, carried a lightsaber with hand grips composed of some sort of wood, fitting as Sa was essentially a shape-shifting sentient plant. Traditionally, a meditation-based ceremony performed within the crystal caves of Ilum included a vision quest. During this process, the Jedi, guided by the Force, would select the crystal that was attuned to him or her by contemplating the following mantra. The crystal is the heart of the blade. The heart is the crystal of the Jedi. The Jedi is the crystal of the Force. The Force is the blade of the heart. All are intertwined. The crystal, the blade, the Jedi. We are one. Finally, through intensive training and focus, the pieces of the lightsaber were to be fused together on a molecular level through use of the Force. The type of lightsaber constructed varied greatly from individual to individual, though the standard lightsaber was, as the name suggests, the most common selection. It surrendered very little in the way of maneuverability, and it was easily concealed. It was the weapon that the 7 traditional forms of lightsaber combat were designed to address directly. The properties of specific lightsabers varied upon the desires and requirements of their respective owners. Kit Fisto, for example, was a Nautolan Jedi Master and as such was amphibious. While the technology to produce a lightsaber which could function underwater without shorting out had existed for quite some time, Master Fisto improved on the older designs and provided detailed instructions on how to modify the weapons for all those who wished to do so. His innovation was widely adopted by the Jedi of his era, who served during the Clone Wars. Palpatine's lightsaber hilt was of another unique design, as it was composed of frick alloy, which meant that his weapon could not be destroyed by opposing lightsaber blades. In general, the possibilities offered for improvement upon the standard lightsaber were seemingly endless. However, even on the basis of its inherent properties, it is the weapon that sacrificed the least. This is the reason why it was generally seen as the most practical selection. Deviations from the norm included the following variant of non-standard lightsabers. The dual-phase lightsaber did not vary drastically from the standard. It used focusing controls to shift between twin crystals, allowing a normal-sized blade to suddenly become twice as long. This was useful only for surprise attacks in the midst of combat, and specialized training with the weapon was not offered. The curved hilt lightsaber. This was considered by some to be the least radical of any of the variants of non-standard lightsabers. The elongated handle accommodated a slight bend which seldom exceeded 30 degrees. The style was common among practitioners of Form 2 lightsaber combat, also known as Makashi, the style favored by Count Dooku. Its balanced weight and precise handling was preferred by masters of Form 2 for saber-to-saber dueling. The weapon offered ergonomic benefits, better fitting into the palm of the hand, and allowed for greater offensive viability due to the variable and unpredictable angles of attack. By simply adjusting one's grip either higher or lower along the hilt, the weapon offered more options during combat and was more difficult to defend against than the standard. It was noted by Kasim, the Twi'lek blade master who instructed Darth Bane, that the curved hilt presented a challenge in that it did render some maneuvers more difficult to perform, but made many others more efficient. The Shoto was a short saber with a blade extending perhaps half a meter in length. The shoto is often wielded in a Jedi's offhand as a second blade. In order to keep things in proportion, smaller Jedi, such as Yoda, used a shoto because it suited their short stature. For Jedi of average height, shotos were, more often than not, used in conjunction with a standard lightsaber. The shoto typically offered more defensive benefits, allowing one to better defend against such weapons as the light whip. A relatively rare variation of the short saber was the guard shoto, which was carried by means of a perpendicular handle, allowing for spins that put an opponent off balance, but also put oneself at risk. It should be noted that throughout the Jedi Order's history, certain battle masters stationed at the Jedi Temple openly disapproved of the use of the guard shoto. As a sort of inverse of the shoto, the light club was a giant-sized lightsaber with a massive handle and a thick blade. Light clubs were often built for use by members of species of unusually large size. It would be an impractical or perhaps even impossible choice of weapon for individuals of average size. Dual-bladed lightsabers, or saber staffs, often carried the connotation of association with the Sith Order. However, there was nothing inherently wicked with the weapon's design. Obviously, the presence of two blades made it easier to simultaneously attack and defend against multiple opponents. The longer handle also allowed for greater leverage to be imparted into one's power attacks. In comparison to the standard lightsaber, the saber staff could do more damage, but it was far less precise and not as well suited to close quarters combat. It required longer sweeping movements that did not transition well into quick stabs or thrusts. In addition, most saber staffs sported an elongated handle which, if targeted, could lead to the weapon's destruction, or at the very least necessitate the user to drastically alter their stance and grip. In truth, this was a detriment that varied in terms of severity based both on how badly the weapon was damaged as well as the ability of the martial artist to rally from the sudden setback. The most impactful benefit attributed to the saber staff was its rarity. Few amongst the Jedi, or even the Sith, were familiar with the weapon because it was so difficult to master. Its rarity made it intimidating and seemingly unpredictable. Those who were unfamiliar with the weapon's properties attempted to keep track of both blades at once, seemingly doubling the amount of options open to one's opponent. In truth, by knowing the location of one blade, one should have also automatically known the location of the other. Using one took years of study, and relatively few Jedi chose to specialize with the weapon. Ultimately, the saber staff was a viable weapon in its own right, and provided a number of benefits which made it more desirable than a traditional weapon. However, this was generally only the case under very specific circumstances, and a lot of the weapon's intimidation factor came from its shock value. At the end of the day, the saber staff is a perfectly valid selection, but on a technical level, it's also more limited than the standard lightsaber. The long-handled single-bladed lightsaber, or light pike as it is sometimes called, employed the same combat style as the dual-bladed lightsaber. Ideally, light pikes made use of a shaft of saber-resistant metal and a short blade on only one end. However, not every light pike included saber-resistant metal. Indeed, some were simply made of wood. And still other designs favored the traditional blade length. In addition to being able to be thrown like a javelin, the weapon provided a great deal more leverage for power attacks than the standard lightsaber. Due to the lack of a second blade, the light pike was a less viable weapon than the saber staff. The light pike did allow a wielder to fight from a greater distance than most of the other lightsaber variants, but if one's opponent managed to close the distance, the light pike was a cumbersome tool to use when on the defensive. And finally, we have the light whip. This was the most exotic of all weapons that used crystal energy-based technology. Instead of having a rigid blade, the light whip's energy tendril was flexible and could be wielded to entangle or cut. The flexible ribbon would twist, turn, and snap in response to both the wielder's physical motions as well as manipulation through the Force. The light whip was far less efficient than any of the traditional lightsaber blades, However, because nobody's training included practicing against the unusual weapon, most combatants were confused when confronted with it. Much like the saber staff, it was intimidating and granted the wielder a psychological edge. The light whip was best defended against by using a traditional lightsaber in conjunction with a Shoto short blade. Okay, now of course there are several unique designs such as Exar Kun's or Darth Vader's. There are also paired lightsabers which can be used to equip oneself with each of the traditional styles of blade depending on their configuration, and indeed there are many more variations and customizations to be found out there, but what I've just listed are the most common weapons that you'll find amongst the Jedi and Sith orders. Now, I mentioned in my most recent collaboration with Evan Nova 95, which was Executor Cedrus vs Darth Nihil, that the long-handled single-bladed lightsaber was, in my opinion, the least practical design apart from the light whip, favored by the Jedi and Sith orders. Two things to really stress here. One, that's simply my opinion. To me, the sacrifice of maneuverability and lack of viability on a defensive front is too high a price to pay for the greater leverage and reach. In my judgment, the weapon's cons outweigh the pros. But again, that's just how I feel. If you disagree, that's completely fine. The second and more important point, when I say it's the least practical choice of weapon, that's only in comparison to the standard lightsaber or the saber staff. Shotos and guard Shotos typically aren't wielded as primary weapons, and the light whip is less efficient than any of the blades. While I much prefer the standard design or curved hilt lightsabers as well as the saber staff to the light pike, that does not mean the light pike is a useless weapon, far from it. To me, it is simply the least desirable of the choices presented. So after all of this, you may be wondering, which variant of lightsaber would I select given the option? Let's get one thing out of the way before I answer. Typically, paired lightsabers are the most worthy selection. The reason for this is because they provide the greatest amount of versatility, since they can equip one with the ability to adopt single blade, dual blade, or saber staff techniques. This is the weapon which would allow you to adapt to the needs of almost any given situation. Because of that, they're a bit of a cop-out to the question. Ideally, a set of paired lightsabers would be my choice. However, if I'm going to take that option off the table and truly commit to only one of the traditional variants, here's my answer. Honestly, the standard lightsaber is already an extremely attractive design to me. The fact of the matter is, it sports uninhibited and unmodified study of each of the traditional lightsaber forms. Greater maneuverability, greater viability when forced to fight in extremely tight spaces or close quarters, it is more easily concealed and mastered than the other designs, and it is not as dangerous for the wielder as the saber staff or light whip can be. Now, perhaps anticlimactically, I would most likely select the curved hilted lightsaber. It's one of the least extreme departures from the standard, a design I feel leaves little to be improved upon as it is. While it does render some maneuvers more difficult to perform, it makes many others more efficient, and so for that reason, it would be my selection. Just to be clear, I don't think any of the weapons are lousy, and in the hands of a master, great things can be achieved with any of the designs. I just have my preferences. To me, the curved hilt is my favorite, with the standard weapon running as a close second, but that's just my opinion. I hope I succeeded in clarifying my point, and if this video informed some of you, then that's great too. Feel free to leave a comment detailing your own selection of weapon, or your thoughts on the properties attributed to the various designs in the comment section below. Catch you on the next video. Bye.